Okay, so let's see, is my audio working? Okay, that seems to be working. So let me bring this up here. So, this is what we're going to be doing. I once again have the Azula document open. If you were here for the Azula stream I did, was it this year? I forget. Either way, I have this document from before Azula in the Spirit Temple, but it still has, like, I think, a lot of really interesting kind of discussion topics because the Azula comic is very much a continuation of like a lot of what we were talking about before. So we have a lot of these topics to go over, but I do also have a specific section here for Azula in the Spirit Temple stuff specifically. So I have some images here in this, but I didn't go too crazy in terms of like adding too much commentary in the document. Just because it's a live stream, we'll get there in the discussions, of course. I of course have my copy of the book here, so if we do need to reference kind of like other stuff, I can somehow show it off on the stream if we absolutely need to. But yeah, I think there's probably some kind of ground, kind of base level stuff we probably should kind of go over as well. Like, I think every time the Azula topic comes up, we kind of have to almost define redemption because some people immediately take it to be a specific way when actually it is this rather broad topic, as we can see here. And it's just that kind of idea that, there is nuance to this. It's not just villain to hero. It's not just the Zuko style redemption arc. A hero can redeem themselves as well, and a villain can change into like an anti-hero or something like that. And I think for the most part with Azula, most people want something in the vein of this rather than a full Zuko kind of style redemption. But the whole point here is that fundamentally people want some sort of a character arc that changes Azula in some certain ways, so that we have her in a better position. And I think this comic definitely feels like it is part of something resembling a redemption arc because the comic is having a nuanced take on the character. So yeah, like that's what I kind of go over here. Again, we covered this in like one of the previous streams, but like the idea that we're hoping for in the end is that like she can still have, we still want so many of these elements of her character to be there, but we want to get to an Azula where she can have another side to her, so that she isn't just this kind of controlling character and that's all she can do. That's what we're looking for here. Like I say here, we want an Azula who can still control a room with her commanding charisma. She can still be a leader if she is on a mission, if she is doing something. She can still do most of the classic Azula stuff. But what we want is in the more casual moments that she can just be relaxed with her family, friends, whatever it is by the time we get to that point. Because again, the whole point here is that we're trying to point out that Azula is not Ozai 2.0. I think it's blatantly obvious that there's enough differences between who Azula is and Ozai. There are similarities, yes, but there's clear differences. And to me, that makes it clear they're not going down the same path of making Azula kind of irredeemable. So that's the kind of whole point here, is that we're hoping to get that. The other point that I led off with in this topic was sort of the idea of sympathy for the character, and the kind of question that I think everyone probably needs to answer, which is just like, do you feel a sympathy? And then, are we as the audience meant to? So it's kind of the personal question, but then is sort of the intent of what is presented with Azula meant to do that? And I think the answer is yes and yes, just to certain degrees, of course, while still acknowledging that the character always had this choice, because that's the kind of whole point here, is like, you have to, I think, feel at least something for her in moments like this and other scenes where, that's not just a character who's been defeated. That's a character who is broken for a variety of different reasons, and the reasoning behind why that happens to her is interesting to talk about. And I think, again, Sympathy, there is some there. And it's just the same for like a lot of characters is, you know, you have sympathy for Zuko because of how Ozai impacted his life, but Ozai impacted like the life of like every member of his family, basically. Zuko is a victim. Ursa is a victim of Ozai as well. And that's what needs to be kind of brought up kind of a lot throughout all of this. Like, that's, in a way, the arc that we're still doing with the Fire Nation royal family is, I think we definitely want to get to a point where Ozai, as like effectively the last remnant of the evil line of Fire Lords, his impact, his legacy shouldn't go on. And that's, I think, why it's also important for Azula to have some sort of an arc that takes her away from the path of villainy, to highlight that Ozai doesn't get to win, like, at all. Zuko's gone down a different path. Ursa has grown, and Azula should be able to too, and that's what we'll get into. We'll talk about how Azula feels about Ozai and the few interesting lines in this comic about that. And that's the kind of, you know, important thing. But the thing with Azula is that she's the one who gets the direct impact of Ozai, because he chooses her. He focuses on her, whereas he abandoned Zuko, and that obviously created a specific issue for Zuko, but it meant Zuko didn't have that much of a connection to Ozai to a certain degree. Obviously there were issues and challenges. We saw Zuko's arc play out, but now it's different for Azula because, as the book kind of points out, Ozai was kind of, in her way of looking at it, like one of the only people who was consistently there for her in her life. Now, what being there for her means is obviously a big difference. Then the other side of this is just like, kind of in a way, what would a changed Azula look like? And this is where I bring up the beach scene of an Azula after an arc. I think you see a bit more of this Azula, the more normal, awkward in a social situation Azula, and that's kind of what I think you would hope to see a little bit more of at the end of an arc, of like, she can interact with like May and Tylee and other characters like this in a setting where she doesn't feel like she needs to command the room, and there would be more situations where she doesn't feel like she needs to command the room. And that's the thing here, like Zuko's awkward as well in many ways, but Azula, we really see, has like no clue when she kind of turns off the kind of commanding presence. When she doesn't do this, you see this different side of her. And so, you know, the jealousy of Tylee and how natural everything seems to be for her in these kind of social kind of settings is quite interesting to look at. And I think this is where you do see the hope for her character of like, yeah, like, show us more of this Azula, like, you know, hanging out with her friends. Because I think in a moment like this, you actually see that, like, the question often comes up of like, so wait, were May and Tylee ever truly friends with Azula? And I think in scenes like this, you see that, like, it's yes. Like, we know it is the case from, like, you know, they knew each other when they were children and stuff like that. And yes, while Azula might have always been the one who was the leader of them, there's something there. But of course, as the book makes clear, Azula does need to evolve to keep these people around her. Like, there is something that needs to change for Azula. So we have that, you know, yeah. Is this the side of Azula that we might actually see? Just like socially awkward Azula a little bit more, and just that kind of contrast with her. You know, her Zuko here moment, Azula here moment. Then we do have to bring up Ursa, and I think we obviously talk about nuance required with Azula, but also nuance was required with Ursa as well. I've seen a little bit too much, I think, people having the very sympathetic view towards Azula. who then take this super negative view on Ursa as a character and as a mother to Azula. Now, it's obviously a super complicated dynamic. This is probably like the key dynamic for Azula. As you can see from like a shot like this is actually a super key scene in terms of, I think, understanding the character of Azula, because this is the moment where the hallucination, the vision of Ursa says, I love you. It's not, I thought you were a monster. She says, I love you. So it's this reveal in a way that deep down Azula knows the whole monster thing is something she made up and that this is the truth. But anyway, the whole point here is, again, Ursa, I don't feel, is a bad mother. And Azula, especially when she's younger, in some of the scenes that we see, she does have like pretty bad behavior. And I think, as you sort of see to some extent from the new comic, the idea of Azula, because she was probably prompted by Ozai to be like, yeah, do whatever you want, like controlling every situation and just acting how you feel is exactly what I want you to do. Ursa actually being like, hey, no, that's not okay, is something that probably helps Azula as we go forward. And again, it's that idea of, you know, what's Ursa meant to do in this situation. Like people criticize her for trying to be a parent, but then they also want her to do almost like superhero-esque things and save Azula somehow from this crazy situation. And that's the thing. It's complicated. That it's like, yes, could she have done a little bit more or done things in a slightly different way? Yes, absolutely. But how she actually did handle it, I don't think you can be super critical, because of, you can't forget about the search backstory with Ursa. And I think a lot of people do, that how her life was turned completely upside down by the royal family and so on and stuff like that. Let's see. Can we download the presentation? I'll see about that maybe at some point. I don't have it set up, and it would take me a while to sort it out overall. But I'll see maybe after the stream about kind of like maybe organizing something like this where like it is a public document or something like that. But I don't think I have the time to organize that right now. But you know, we'll see about that. So yeah, we have a lot of these things here. This question is an interesting one. I think the comic seems to answer this as Ozai, yes, but I also think you can look at scenes when she is quite young and kind of look at them as like, I do think they're kind of pointing out that Azula is, even as a child, a specific type of child. And Ozai just obviously didn't help maybe certain kind of behaviors and stuff like that. So this is one of those things where like what we want at the end is somewhat of a balanced character between this, you know, social awkward character and then the, you know, cruel, calculating character that we know her to be. This is all pre-Azula in the Spirit Temple here. Of course, you know, but the idea of, you know, how did Ursa's banishment impact Azula? When it initially happens, obviously our focus is more on Zuko, and Azula seems like she's in a very strong position as that kind of flashback comes to an end. But again, it's like deep down, Azula in time, I think, comes to realize that, oh, only having Dad around isn't so great. So that is a kind of interesting thing. There's the whole key situation, which the new comic doesn't really bring up, but a key point is, like, obviously with Ursa in the comic. I'll get up this page, actually. I think I have it down here somewhere. Is it? Yeah, here. This one. This here. this is where I'm like, you can't tell me there's not some sort of an arc with Azula happening. Just because, like, these two panels exist, effectively. Just this, and pretty much everything surrounding how Azula really feels about her mother, it's so clear that she needs to actually have a conversation with her mother, post her mother getting her actual face, her actual memories back. And it feels like, in a way, we have to see somewhat of a repeat of this scene of, like, if there is someone who does need to maybe apologize to Azula before Azula apologizes back, it probably is Ursa to create this kind of emotional moment again. But you could see the impact of, even though this Noriko in this moment doesn't have her memories, she still latches on to the kind of true emotions of the situation. And that's kind of the point. And similarly, like, a lot of people do bring up kind of points about how, like, oh, like I don't want Azula to be redeemed because the other characters don't feel that way, when it's like, I don't think that's the case at all. Ursa absolutely wants to have a relationship with her daughter. I think it's clear on so many occasions. Zuko, in his how he acts in this comic and in Smoke and Shadow, wants to have a relationship with his sister, as you can see here. It kind of, in a way, doesn't matter to him what Azula does. He would like to have her in his life. And I think in other parts of the search, you also see that, like, the rest of Team Avatar is kind of supportive of this. They're like, yes, like, we support the idea of you trying to kind of fix this relationship with your sister. Sokka kind of teaches him a little bit of that. Aang is very on board with this sort of thing. As we know, he's not going to hold grudges over the whole I killed you situation. So there's that. And I think Katara was effectively supportive in the background because she was right there when we got this moment. She saw this breakdown and, in a way, saw that, oh, Azula isn't just the, like, brutal character. Like, this is, like I said earlier, this is more than just I've lost a fight. This is something more. And I think Katara does latch onto that. So there's that. And again, like, a lot of the other scenes I highlight from the other comics is that, like, you see this edition in the comic that Ursa did say goodbye to Azula when she left. It's just that Azula didn't wake up, whereas obviously in the episode, like we saw, Zuko did wake up. And that's an interesting kind of one. Here's the moment of, like, the kind of jealousy of, like, oh, you had to have a new daughter type situation. That's an interesting one. And then, yeah, she runs away. This is kind of where you get into the idea of, this is where she potentially had a moment to have her arc make progress way before. Is that if she had stuck around, she would have kind of witnessed her mother change back and had a conversation there. Plus, Zuko said that I'm very open to, talking to you again. And again, this line here is highly important. The whole view of strong, weak. It relates to Ozai, of course, from the finale, telling Aang that he is he's weak, even though, when he comes out of the Avatar state and doesn't kill him, it's just like, oh, you're the most powerful thing in the world, but you're still weak. Skewed view on what that is. Whereas Zuko, despite everything in a way Azula has done, still wanting his sister in his life, is like showing that sort of strength of, like, I can look past that stuff, like, I still care about you. And she runs off away from kind of her feelings again, because, she's just had this hugely emotional moment. She doesn't want to tackle it right now. And it makes sense, I think, back here where Azula in the search is all over the place. Like, I think she needed the time away to, kind of stabilize herself, which is kind of what happens as we go through Smoke and Shadow. And we get moments like, her noting that Ozai's not involved in this. None of what I'm doing is to try and sort of bring Ozai back into power, because she views Ozai as basically being like, well, he doesn't have his bending anymore, therefore he is weak and useless to me, basically. And And, you know, you could see, like, she latches onto this about kind of anger and revenge, which the new comic relates to as well, is this sort of thing, and why she latches onto the Kumurikage story of basically mothers who, in their want for vengeance over what happened to their children, became spirits and haunted the warlords of the early Fire Islands. Like, that is a story that, like, you know, Azula latches onto. And then we get into some of this stuff of, like, you know, the trajectory of Azula's character in Smoke and Shadow. The whole almost tease here of, is this the path for her character? What if she was to, in the proper way, become the advisor to the Fire Lord? Use the skills that she has, in a way, a lot of skills that Zuko doesn't have, but she is able to realize that the throne isn't her destiny. Azula's destiny isn't the throne. I think that's very clear. We know this to be the case. Azula, as far as we're aware, never becomes Fire Lord at any point. So it doesn't happen. And I think in this moment, I always viewed this as being a very strong moment for her, is that she realized that she isn't meant for the throne. And it's like, this is something that I think we see a lot in, I think, Azula in the Spirit Temple. It's the idea of progress, progress, progress. Zuko says, go on. And then she's just like, and I'll make you into the Fire Lord I was meant to be. And you're like, come on, Azula, really? Like, that's the wrong final, reasoning on this. Because I think it's like, yeah, really, really, really good. And then it's like, and I'll make you into me. And so it's just like, oh, so you're basically just not the Fire Lord on a technicality? No. And again, it's the idea of she doesn't view Zuko as strong. And it's just, she's come to this conclusion that Zuko, his destiny is to be the person on the throne, but not understanding why that's correct and the strength that he eventually got to kind of earn that position. She doesn't get it. That's the kind of whole point here. Let's see. What happened to Azula in Legend of Korra? We have no idea. There is no mention at all of Azula in Legend of Korra. The ending of this new comic is the furthest into the timeline content that we have with Azula. So we have no clue what happened after this point whatsoever. That's why she's obviously such an interesting character, is because she's got this like wide open character arc, and we don't have a clue what happens at any point in the future. And then, yeah, like, she's like, I will turn you into me, and then in a sense I'll be Fire Lord again. And Zuko's right. And I've always interpreted the end of Smoke and Shadow as being Azula has made the wrong choice. And I think what we see in the Legends RPG material of like constant failed attacks, and then what we see in this comic is consistent failures at trying to execute on whatever her plan is here. She is not having an effect on influencing Zuko, and as far as we are aware, she hasn't. Otherwise, I think we would have seen some of it in this comic. Let's see. Next Azula comic by next year-ish. My answer is no. And I'll bring up this point here, getting into the Azula and the Spirit Temple stuff here. Getting into it a little bit. Where do I have it here? Yeah. The lack of progress in Azula's arc within this book is less, I think, down to the fact that, like, this book itself didn't redeem Azula as a character. It's a relatively short comic, 72 pages. After 7 years of not having Azula content, did anyone really think one comic was going to get her over the line? And especially when Avatar Studios is something that is on the horizon. So we do have this problem with planning and the sense of like what exactly is happening going forward. But this is the truth of it right here. The comics don't tell big stories anymore. So Azula's arc, I think, basically has to continue in an Avatar Studios project. Because as far as we're aware, the next Avatar comic coming out is the June Iro comic, The Bounty Hunter and the Tea Brewer. There's a Korra comic with Mako coming out. then there should be another Avatar one-shot comic, which, based on the history of one-shots, will be about a different character other than, we assume, Katara, Toph, Suki, Azula, Iroh, June. It'll be a character who's not one of them. And then we don't know what they're going to do after that. We assume they'll do more one-shot comics. Maybe they'll do another Azula one, but I would say it's not a super likely prospect. So unless they start up the part 1, part 2, part 3 trilogies of comics again, I don't see where they're going to tell the big story for Azula. What's going to be the continuation, I think, is one of these animated projects. Now, the question is, will it be the first movie, this October 2025 movie, with adult team Avatar? Now, it's going to be, this movie is set like, what, eight or so years or something like that, after basically the events of this comic. So it's quite a big gap if that's where we're going to do Azula's story. But it would certainly make for the most probably like ideal villain for that story, where we finally get to see the gang older, and it's maybe the final time of Azula being the villain. There's the rumor, and again, keep in mind, it is a rumor, that one of the other Avatar Studios projects will be a more Zuko-specific, focused movie. There's been no information on that since rumors from like a year and a half ago. So we don't really know what's actually happening with regards to that. Again, just that first movie, 2025, is going to be adult team Avatar focused. Now, Azula could be the villain in that. We don't know. But I'm assuming Azula will play some sort of a role in one of these projects. So there either has to be a huge evolution with the comics to get us to important stuff, or we just have to do her in animation. So that's the kind of big question right now, because I don't know how you can look at the output of the comics of the last few years and imagine where this big Azula story comes from. This is, I think, in a way, the best we could have expected from an Azula comic with the comics as they are currently. And I think this is definitely the best of the one-shots, which we'll get into as we sort of start the discussion here. But that's the kind of prospect there. Let's see, some questions in the chat. Would you agree that Azula suffers from some serious delusions? Her view on reality is very skewed, even if she hides it very well. Yeah, so this is the question about, like, I suppose, like, Azula, does she actually have, like, a proper kind of, like, mental condition? That is something that she needs to get over. Or is it just the arc of a character who is very, very confused? And they are two separate things, because, of course, one arc would effectively require, like, the writers to have specific knowledge of kind of mental health conditions and stuff like that, and how to get a character kind of through that. The other is the more typical, I suppose, fictional way of dealing with this kind of inner conflict, and that is, the character encountering the key characters to their arc and kind of getting over it that way. Azula, like, I think the Azula that we have now, I think, is past the full-on, like, hallucinations that I was kind of referencing before, like, throughout the search, throughout the end of ATLA. I think the Azula that we see in Smoke and Shadow here is a more stable Azula who doesn't have, who isn't, like, to that point, but because she has was raised in such a specific way, to be a tool for Ozai rather than a person, she's missing some very, very key things with regards to, like, how she kind of treats people and so on. And that's what she kind of needs to evolve past. I don't know necessarily if they're really going to overly emphasize that, like, Azula is suffering from, like, a mental condition, and this is something that the heavy focus is on. Because I think this book kind of makes it clear that Azula is able to see through illusions, basically. Like, what the spirit does to her effectively in this book. She is aware at pretty much every instance that what she is seeing isn't real. She doesn't fall into the kind of ideal world and immediately be like, yes, this is all what I wanted. So it's not that she's so far gone, but she definitely has those kind of skewed views on things that she needs to move past and evolve through. And that's what we're going to, I suppose, discuss as we kind of go through with this. Let's see, I feel like we need one more Azula comic. The Zuko comic takes place 5+ years after the events of the Spirit Temple comic. Like, stuff like that, the concept of like a comic that skips ahead multiple years is a very, very cool idea, but we have no evidence to suggest that that is something that Dark Horse are going to do. The Avatar and Korra comics are very stuck in... With Avatar, we're in the Avatar time period. With Korra, we're in the Korra time period. We're not really jumping around all that much. We'll see with Avatar Studios if they maybe make those decisions, but there's been some very set ways that they do things, ultimately. So what else do we have here? Stepping stone for the character. Needs time to play out. Yeah, that's the big thing here, is that like getting into some of this initial discussion. Obviously, I went over these kind of the top of the document, but the idea is, I think the comic presents the nuances of Azula very well. The idea that she's done bad things and treats people badly, but the sympathy is still there for her. You can't ignore Ozai's influence. You can't ignore the struggles that she has dealing with her own feelings, and you see that consistently throughout this book. She is constantly at kind of war within herself of like, this is the way, like, in a way, my father thought me to be and how I'm meant to view this, but I don't actually feel about it this way. What do I do? There's a lot of that from Azula. So the idea is she's not an irredeemable villain, nor is she someone who has done nothing wrong. Like, these two things are exactly the same. So there's that. And then, yeah, I covered the whole redemption thing. It can be mixed. It can be minor progress. It can be bigger if it needs to be. But I do think this is the case. I have seen very few fans ask for a full Azula redemption. Like, no one, I don't think wants Azula to be... No one wants Azula to be the new Team Avatar member. I think her arc is going to be, she fixes her relationship with her family, and maybe eventually over time with Mei and Ty Lee, and we slowly go from there. She might be involved in certain kind of situations, but her arc, I do think, is very much about the people close to her, rather than this is a person who will be the new Team Avatar member. That was Zuko's arc. This is something different. And then again, I think this is important to note as well, and we covered that already. So yeah, my general thoughts on the book, and I feel I've been consistent on this since my early review all the way up to now, which is a funny thing because, of course, I got to put out basically like the first proper review of this comic like 4 months ago. And it's always a tricky thing there because there is a bit of pressure kind of realizing that like, oh yeah, I'm going to put out basically like the first like in-depth thoughts about this kind of really hyped book. I hope I do it well. I was pretty happy with the early review I put out. And the fact that like, I think my spoiler review on release that I put out is pretty, similar in terms of like my thoughts. Like, I haven't really changed my thoughts much. Just kind of highlights that. So this is the very short summation from me of the book. Excellent character exploration, but it does lack big progress advancement. Now, the question, the stuff obviously that we just covered is, I don't think anything really suggested there was going to be massive advancement because this is just the way Avatar has been for the last few years. This is the way the comics have been for the last few years. A one-shot comic, an equivalent comic to Katara and the Pirate Silver, Toph Beifong's Metal Bending Academy. I don't think it was ever going to do this. As much as the back of the book, says, and finally faces her chance at redemption, you have to acknowledge it's a marketing tagline to get people hyped. And it is still true. The book does offer Azula the chance at redemption. She just chooses no. And we'll get into why that no isn't as concrete for all time as like you would make it out to be. So like I think like the writing is very good in this comic. And I think that's one thing I really wanted to emphasize in my videos, was that I don't just think it's well written. I think it's like particularly well written. And again, coming from a writer who was initially afraid to write for Azula because of the expectations on the character. That is kind of one of those things. But I think the general reception to the book has been, I would say, like pretty much universally very good. I've heard, I think, little bits and pieces of like people not quite liking it or having issues here or there, but I think in general it's been received quite well, compared to if it was a bit of a disaster, I think would see it all over the place a lot more. So I think only the people who have the most hyper specific view on the character have an issue with this book, is I think what it comes down to. So we then get into this. This is probably what I got to open up with on the idea of kind of progress within with the character. It seems clear that despite her rejecting the offer of redemption from the spirit, that her arc will continue. The rejection is definitely, in my opinion, not a like for all time thing. It is like in this specific moment with this specific build up, she said no. But the way in which she said no is interesting to analyze, which we'll get into. There's like this is the big point here. There's so much that she's like refusing or dodging, like addressing about herself, that it's clear that in a way there's a reason a 2023 comic brought up a lot of these topics, but then didn't like do anything necessarily beyond kind of highlighting that they exist. We're tackling these things with her in the future, basically. This comic is basically Azula alone, in the kind of strict sense of the word of like Zuko alone. That shows this. But I think what you take away from this is definitely that her arc, if it's when it's to actually progress, is going to actually involve the real characters of Ursa, Zuko, May, and Tylee. Not just visions of them happening internally with the help of a spirit, but actual Ursa, actual Zuko, actual May, actual Tylee. That's what's needed. That Azula on her own was not able to make the step forward, but with the help, potentially, of other characters, maybe that will happen. So, let's see what happens here. So yeah, and then we get into the Zuko alone comparison here. Here's the screenshot from basically when he says the line at the end of the episode. He's just won the fight. He's revealed himself to be a firebender. He's asked, "Who are you?" And he says, "My name is Zuko, son of Ursa and Fire Lord Ozai, prince of the Fire Nation and heir to the throne." And this is like 7 episodes into book 2, where Zuko has had moments of growth. He has seen the issues that the rest of the world have with the Fire Nation. He's banished. He's on the run. He isn't effectively a royal anymore. And here he, for some reason, reclaims the title. Like he mentions his father despite all the issues. He reclaims his title even though he technically doesn't have it anymore. He says he's heir to the throne even though he's not anymore. And it's this kind of amazing episode that ends with this moment of like, he goes back to, if I capture the Avatar, I can get my honor back. My father will welcome me back. I can be the prince again. I can be the heir. And he is brought back down to earth. And Azula has effectively exactly the same thing. As she rejects the opportunity to redeem herself. She says, "I'm Azula, daughter of Ozai, the Phoenix King. I'm the rightful Fire Lord." She says, like, kind of like Zuko does. He says a couple of things that aren't true at the moment and goes back to the way he was. Azula does the same thing of Ozai never really was the Phoenix King, and he certainly isn't at the moment. And Azula isn't the rightful Fire Lord. In fact, she said back in Smoke and Shadow, she knows she's not the rightful Fire Lord. What's going on here? She's going back to the way she's meant to be by Ozai. So the analysis here is obviously that, like, despite progress, Zuko reverts back to his birthright when asked who he is. He says it confidently, but the truth of his situation is thrown back at him by the villagers, both of him being the banished prince and that the rest of the world hates the Fire Nation. That was not a clever thing to say in that moment, given the progress that you had made there during this moment. In the comic, Azula reverts back, basically because it's the idea of, like, that royal pride, effectively, of, like, someone like me would never ask for or resort to asking for forgiveness. She thinks it's a weak thing to do. Only weak people do something like that, which obviously is a flawed way of thinking. It's the flawed view on what strength actually is. And she's not fully acknowledging it, but it's the idea of both of them being these stubborn refusals to accept the truth of the situation. And it's the idea that Zuko's arc had ups and downs. Azula's, we expect, will also have ups and downs. But both arcs, I think, will be different overall. So, yeah, the progress is pretty simple. I think these 2 pages kind of highlight that even though she rejects the redemption from the spirit, look at this scene from earlier on in the book, just after the Fire Warriors leave. She is furious. She's storming around the forest. She's calling them traitors. She's saying that she will hunt them down. How dare they do this? This is what I need to do. How dare they go against this? I will make them pay. And what happens at the end of the book? Like, if Azula has really not progressed at all, when she finds them again, she'll go back to this, surely. She wants to hunt down the traitors and make them pay. But no, she says this when she sees them. "Silly girls, unworthy of my leadership. I'll find new followers, a new place to rule. I always do." She leaves. She justifies a reason for why she leaves, but there is a kind of underlying sense of she found them happy and left them like that. Because that is the kind of truth of it. If you see the page here, she finds the rest of the Fire Warriors chilling out, being happy without her. They got Chio back, going against Azula's orders, and they're happy. And it's this idea of, like, they don't need her anymore. And she says they are unworthy, which relates back to the very start of the book, of course. Because what's the first line in the book? It's the idea of, like, she knows who's worthy, some will never be. And again, it's one of those situations where you criticize Azula for, like, do you actually know who is worthy? Or what the situation is. That's the kind of interesting point. And so what seems to be happening with Azula at the end of the book is, like, that's progress. She's not going after the people who abandoned her. But what she is doing is she's going to start the cycle again. Azula is a super capable character who will draw people towards her because she's an amazing leader and is charismatic in a very specific way that will create groups around her. But she's not going to keep it forever because of the lack of kind of care shown to them overall. And that's the kind of problem here. And it means that the book ends with in a situation where, like, Azula's arc is very open, in that the writers could pick her up and have her with a group over here, a group over here. She could be in charge of a town over here in a couple of years' time, and that could be where one of these movies happens. But the idea seems to be it is this cycle repeating itself. What happened was that in Smoke and Shadow, we saw the first failing of the Kamurakage, the Fire Warriors. The RPG material highlights that there's been failures since that moment. We see at the start of this comic a failure. And it seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. Because let's go to the very start of this book and see what actually happens here when we really break it down. It's Azula's group getting outmaneuvered by Ty Lee and some guards. Not even like a special team of notable named characters or anything like that. One main character and guards are able to take down Azula, basically force Azula and her team to retreat. How could this have gone so wrong for Azula? And I think that's meant to show it's the wrong path. That Azula is capable of leading at the highest level, but it hasn't been working because this plan to undermine Zuko to make him better isn't really it. Do you have a Discord server? No, I don't. The main reason I don't is just because it's an extra kind of time thing that I'm not sure I would have time to like moderate. So that's why I haven't committed to doing anything with it at the moment, making one at all. It's always something like I'll consider maybe at some point, but I'm just kind of very wary of adding an extra thing I need to keep track of when the focus is on making videos, live streams and stuff like that. And I wouldn't want to basically be in a situation where I'm making less videos because I have to manage a Discord. But that's just that situation here. So yeah, that's the Azula kind of progress, like just literally kind of bookmarks in the book. Progress is made. So there's that. And then I highlight this here at the start as well in terms of progress. I just think it's an interesting one in terms of, again, the idea that some people do view the character as being maybe a bit more cruel than I think is actually the case. The idea of, like, she's not out to kill people. Even, I think even though like it in the specific instance in the book it's about Ty Lee, like are you going to kill Ty Lee? I think this applies to pretty much like everyone overall, and it's this idea of like, yeah, like, oh, what do you want? Oh, you finally captured Ty Lee after your fight. Now what do you want? Now that you have her there in front of you, what are you going to do? What is it you want? Are you going to kill her? And look at the expression on Azula's face there. There's clearly a sense of like shock, and it's like, wait, what? Like the concept of killing Ty Lee is a shocking prospect to Azula. Why would I do that? And the spirit's just like, I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out what you want. So it's this clear idea of like, she wants the people in her life, but then she treats them poorly, and they leave her. She then gets angry, and at this point doesn't really know what to do. Or what she wants beyond that, she does want these people in her life. You know, it's just this weird sense of like, she wants the people here. How does she actually make that happen? That's the situation. So the spirit is obviously trying to figure this out. Azula says yes eventually to, let me get the page up here. I'm not sure if I have this one actually. Yeah, it's the start of this page here. Ursa, the spirit as Ursa asked the question, and finally Azula says yes to, this is what I want. And it's the idea of, you know, so what you want most in the world is for those who broke your trust, your family, your friends, your acolytes, to return and ask for your forgiveness, for them to acknowledge how they hurt you, and to promise to never do so again. So a complete reverse of sort of like what is actually, I suppose, what should happen. The idea that, no, you apologized to me. I've done nothing wrong. You betrayed me, rather than I treated you poorly. To gain your freedom back, you left me. If I want you back in my life, I have to apologize to you. She's kind of reversing it here. But it's a hesitant yes, as you can see there. It's a ... yes. And she looks away. So it's not the truth. I think she knows deep down that's the sort of like demanding what is expected of her to be said. Commanding Azula would be like, yeah, apologies are for the weak, but she wants people to apologize to her. That's the sort of situation. It's an interesting one. And then, you know, as we see like throughout the book, like with regards to stuff like her ideal life, and the idea that like the spirit initially latches onto this idea that, oh, you know, is it just that you want to be loved and embraced by your family? Is that it? And I think the spirit actually gets it right in this moment, is that like fundamentally this is what Azula wants. But this can't happen until Azula changes. And this is the kind of crux of it, is that the whole reason that like we get the scene here. Let me show this. We get the kind of ideal world scene here with the family. Like everyone there, Zuko with no scar and all this sort of stuff. Is like, it's unrealistic because some of those characters aren't even alive anymore. Some of those characters don't look like that. And some of those characters would just never act that way. Your family is messy. That is a truth. Like, and I think that's the, in a way, fundamental truth that Azula needs to accept, is that her family life is never going to be perfect because it was messy from the start, because of what like Azulon did, basically. Because of this plan to incorporate the blood of an avatar into the royal family. Because they did that with Ursa. And Ozai treated Ursa the way he did in that relationship. The family was in a bad spot the second that whole stuff happened. And you can even go further back than that with the whole way the royal family operates, with regards to testing siblings against each other, to force this rivalry, to create these kind of ruthless characters. And that's why we have all these iterations of this kind of throughout the generations. It is this like very, very complicated family situation, and that's why it being as simple as just, oh, I want them all there, but they'll never be like that. They'll never say those specific things to you. Your mother can never be the perfect mother you wanted, because like you acknowledge in this book, you have suffered because of Ozai. She has too. And it's the extent to which Azula like understands how much her mother's been affected by Ozai. That's a very, very interesting one. And I suppose in the chat, that's an interesting question of like, at this point, like how much of Ursa's like backstory and like the truth of Ursa's situation within the royal family does she know? She knows some of it because of the plot of the search, but the actual Ursa backstory that we're presented with, of course, is Ursa telling that backstory to Zuko, basically starting from the end of the search comic, and Azula's not there anymore. So there's that. Let's see. Would I be down to be in an Avatar Discord server? Probably not the right point to choose that stuff now, but something again I'll look into probably after the stream. Will Zuko order full mobilization of domestic forces led by him to find Azula? I don't think he has to. Like, at least based on what we know right now, he doesn't have to, because if Ty Lee and a couple of guards can handle a core part of the Fire Warriors, he doesn't need to use the army to counter her, because all Azula has been doing is basically been kind of needling Zuko. Like, she's causing mischief, not a bit of chaos. But outside of, you would say, the Kumarakage incident in Smoke and Shadow, everything that we get pointed to is just that, like, she's been a frustration, but not a, if we don't stop her, something truly bad will happen. Because Azula does have that weird core intent of trying to actually make Zuko into something better, is the idea. So yeah, Zuko's tired of it, of course, because he would prefer this not to happen. He wants her stopped, but it's one of those situations. If Ty Lee succeeded in capturing... we'll actually go down to that here. I think I have that topic down here. Yeah, Ty Lee. So yeah, we have this cool stuff from the very start of the book of, like, just highlighting how impressive Ty Lee is. And what's so cool about this is, like, Ty Lee gets to lead in this scene. She's the main kind of hero character going up against Azula in this scene. Everyone else is just no-name guards. She gets to chi-block, take down a fire warrior. She gets to up close redirect Azula's lightning, and just show this real growth of, like, this is a super confident Ty Lee in a leadership position that, to some extent, is not really like the character. Like, within the Team Azula dynamic, Azula, May, Ty Lee, you would arguably say Ty Lee is the least leader-like inherently. So the fact that she is a Kyoshi warrior is just naturally leading and doing very well outside of the Team Azula situation is a massive show of growth for Ty Lee, even though she's not in the book for that long at the start. It's highly impressive, you know, just seeing her get to just stand her ground here and just counter Azula like this, and just so confidently, you know, go against her. It's really interesting. Where's the line here? Yeah, just like her being able to say this with such confidence, that, like, I'm going to find you. And this is the character who, even in, like, what, early Smoke and Shadow and stuff like that, is afraid of Azula. You can see how much Ty Lee has changed and how much it has benefited her to be part of the Kyoshi warriors and kind of found her path. Now, the question in chat there, what would, you know, they do if they captured Azula? They're obviously going to bring her back to Zuko. And we know Zuko doesn't want to just put Azula in prison. He wants to try and help her, wants to have a relationship with her. So I'm guessing it would be a situation where, like, it would be him and Ursa who would try to go to see her. I assume there'd be guards there just because, you know, Azula is still dangerous. But captured, I think they can handle her at this point. And it would create, like, a situation, like, it would kind of force Azula's hand. But I'd almost say, like, is capturing her and having her around, would that be helpful for her arc? I kind of feel like her arc has to happen in the middle of something happening almost. But that's the tough part, though, is, like, activating the rest of the arc from this point out. How do you do it? How do you actually get Azula in a scene with Ursa where she will listen? And how does that happen? And that's where, like, a few scenes kind of need to happen of, like, linking a few things together. Like, Azula here doesn't want to kill Ty Lee, but what if she had hit her with lightning? Lightning, in some cases, is a lethal technique if it's generated powerfully enough, but she doesn't want to kill Ty Lee. But what if she accidentally kind of did or came close to doing that? That would be an emotional thing for Azula, of, like, if her or someone on one of her teams hurt May, Ty Lee, someone like that, maybe her mother, you would see potentially a different side of Azula. Like, because there is that kind of protectiveness in a way there to a certain extent, like, might we see a Azula steps in front of an attack or something like that? That it's almost like the more interesting situation of, like, if Azula actually captured Ty Lee rather than the other way around, that would be the interesting situation, because what does Azula actually want to do with her? Not to kill her. Is it to ask for an apology, like, from Ty Lee? And then what would actually happen there? Because I think Ty Lee, more than May, at least initially, is going to be the one to kind of open up more to, like if these friendships are going to happen again, I think it will be Ty Lee before May who, rejoins Azula to a certain degree. So that's the kind of real question here. And I think I mentioned this in a previous video, speculating about this, of, like, what if Azula's next group isn't as sort of noble or nice as the Fire Warriors? What if she actually creates a group where she has people who she actually can't control? Like, what if she had effectively a Red Lotus style group where the members are basically just as powerful as she is, and they are characters capable of actually, like, killing our main characters? What does she do when she doesn't have that control and suddenly May and Ty Lee are in actual trouble? She doesn't want them dead, but now she can't control her crazier and crazier teammates. Does she block that bolt herself? Because are you going to go back to the idea that Zuko blocked the bolt she fired at Katara and do kind of these kind of moments that are kind of similar? There's definitely some interesting things there. As a bit of a side plot, I think it's important that we probably should mention the Fire Warriors themselves, because they it seems like they're being pushed away to the side now because Azula's not part of them anymore. But they do actually get a bit of a chance to shine in this comic at the start here, and to a degree at the end, because they actually explain more context for, like, who they are here than they do, like, anywhere else. So we get Zirine as the other kind of main character, getting a chance to sort of, like, step up, have that argument with Azula, kind of highlight that, hey, the rest of the warriors are close. They're actual friends. The Azula forming this group has sort of facilitated the others actually having really good relationships with each other. So, that's something, but Azula's not part of that. So there's that. They're obviously frustrated by Azula's goal. They don't agree with it anymore. And we get this really interesting idea that they actually want to help those in need in the Fire Nation. Like, that's a new concept, that they have come together and discussed with each other the idea that the Fire Warriors can be a group that actually helps people. And we're not going to do that by doing whatever it is you are trying to do with Zuko. So they have actual good goals in mind to help the downtrodden, kind of Robin Hood style, I guess. And they leave. They leave because of this. But Azula, in her response to kind of keep them in line, does give us better context for what the institution is. Now, this is a thing that's been around since, like, the end of ATLA. We always knew from, like, the old website that Azula ended up in, like, a mental institution at the end of ATLA. That's why that is a plot point in, like, the search and stuff like that. But we actually get the better explanation of it here, is that in many ways, the way it comes across is that it is a mental institution for people who actually have problems, but Fire Nation traditional noble families are putting their daughters in here just because they are rebellious and don't necessarily fit in line with the the heavy traditions of Fire Nation nobility. Like that's actually a really kind of big reveal, because it changes our initial view on the characters as being like, well, what, Azula just has a group of like crazy girls with her? Is that it? Like is there, are you gonna cover that? Now it's actually no. Them being rebellious, too rebellious for traditional royal families, means like nothing. It means like, wow, they spoke out of turn once, that sort of thing, because we know the way that is. Like the best way to view this, I think, is what May says during the beach about like her mother, her father's political career. The idea of like she was expected to be basically silent and just be the good girl, and that's expected of everyone. And we can see that, you know, those who do choose to speak out, they were put in here, and that explains how they have different ideas, because they were sort of abandoned by their own families and put in here for these reasons. They want to change things for people in actual bad positions, because they realize probably more than anyone the problems with the nobility within the Fire Nation. And it also highlights that the institution likely was never going to help Azula as well. So there's that as well. So there's that. And yeah, they save Chio. And this is a big thing here. It's the idea of like, the group wants to save Chio. Azula really, really heavily argues against that, because what is it she says? She basically says that this is war. Sometimes there are casualties of war. She views what she is doing to Zuko as being like a war to create him as the Fire Lord that she needs to be. Like, this is real, like, you just can't see the problem with what you're saying, Azula. That sort of thing. The spirit was forcing redemption on her, although its intention was good. So, yeah, we should probably actually discuss that. I don't even think I necessarily have that here. I had a little bit on it. It's more about the specific monster mentioned, but like, let's talk about the spirit itself here, because I think this is interesting. I wish we had got a name. That's probably the first big thing. Just from a pure lore perspective, I would have really liked to get this spirit's true, like, actual name. What does it call itself? And, you know, that would give us maybe an insight better into what it's truly about. But the intent of this spirit, based on what it says at the start, is that when it's in its quote-unquote light spirit form, people who have these true conflicts within their life, they're at a crossroads, they come to the spirit temple, they sleep there for the night, and they basically get the spirit vision/dreams that will, in the light kind of version, slowly guide them onto the right path. That this spirit literally has the ability to help someone find the right path. And if that's the case, great. It just seems to, I guess, be this helpful spirit that can guide you down the right path. But Azula does see through this early on and can tell it's a lie. And especially when the May and Ty Lee spirits start criticizing her, she gets quite angry and aggressive about this. So this is then what kind of prompts the darkness to come into play. And we see this on, let me get the page. Yeah. You can see here at the bottom of this page, the black kind of green tendrils start to come out. Before this, we hadn't really seen any of that. And this is when the spirit starts to freak out of like, oh no, it didn't work. It's meant to work this way, but now your own feelings are making this basically go out of control. And it's the idea of, I now can't control what you are going to see next. And this is why Azula is effectively like bombarded from this point on with these visions that just kind of criticize her like so heavily. how much of the spirit temple was actually real, or was all of it an illusion? I'm curious. Based on what we see, it seems like the temple, the actual spirit temple, is literally just a kind of spirit manifestation. That once you get caught effectively in this spirit's powers, I think the implication is that when Azula is asleep, this happens. And this is why when at the very end of all of this, she does come out of all of this, having quote unquote defeated the spirit, in the camp exactly where she was. That this effectively all happened that night. So the everything except the, I suppose, true form of the spirit that we kind of see here was just a manifestation of the visions, effectively. There isn't just a giant random temple out there. Let's see, it doesn't look to the same camp spot. Like, I think there's definitely a sense that, like, she definitely walks through the forest, I think. But I think the idea is, at some point during her walk through the forest, that's when she gets, in a way, caught in the power of the spirit. And spirity stuff happens and she ends up back where she kind of started, basically. So I think that's the kind of intent of all of this. Because, you know, as we see throughout the comic, like, she tries to walk out the door. And then she basically ends up turned around. That it really only exists in a small kind of form. Let's see. So can the temple appear in anywhere in the world, or just that one location? I'm assuming it's a typical spirit dynamic where it's the spirit of this forest, and so it has its location that it kind of does things in. Theoretically, I guess it could set up shop wherever it wants to, but it chooses to do it in this forest because, you know, it's a little bit out of the way. The idea is that you're probably more likely to walk into people dealing with struggles in their life to use your powers, you know, setting it up in a kind of forest, kind of off out this way. So an interesting kind of idea, but also, like, look at the idea here of, like, I take many forms, and it is your cruelty and desire for vengeance that has shaped me into this. A mirror of your own inner self, a monster. And again, this is that kind of interesting idea of, like, okay, what's going on here? Like, that is implying that this is not actually the true form of this spirit. That this is the, I guess, quote-unquote, dark spirit version of this form. This is the monster Heibai version. Heibai has that panda light spirit form. So we almost, in a way, don't get to properly see what this spirit maybe actually looks like. My interpretation is probably that the true form of this spirit, do I have an image? Is that I'm guessing the true form of this spirit looks something like this. And there's a significance to the whole, you know, as it turns into Zuko, it sort of transforms into kind of like demon Oni Zuko. That this humanoid form is probably not exactly the form of this spirit, but it is something like that, but not as monstrous as the actual, like, look of it here. So that's I think the idea of it here. Now, obviously, this is one of the actual forms of it, because Azula hits this with lightning, and that's the thing. Because, like, I think the tiny form is its true form. Everything else Azula sees are just manifestations. Like, potentially, and that's the thing of, like, does she win the fight in the, like, the question here is ultimately, does she defeat a vision version of the spirit, breaking her out of the vision, and the spirit is actually just the small version that we see later on in the comic. Where is it? Here. Like, is that actually the size of the spirit? Or is it that size now because Azula hit it with lightning? This would obviously fit the interpretation that we have of damaging spirits. If you wound a spirit with bending, it gets smaller. We see that with Rava and Vatu. That's the way it's described with a glowworm in the novels as well. In his fight with Karuk, when you damage a spirit, it gets smaller and smaller until eventually, it's tiny effectively. So the implication, I think, here is that eventually she does, in my mind, I'm thinking she actually does make it smaller than it once was. Through whatever way she does this, by lightning bending the entire vision or this form within the vision, she does actually defeat this spirit in some way. And it's now smaller than it once was. Just because I'm assuming a spirit that is powerful enough to trap people in kind of visions like this probably has to be relatively large, because that's a notable ability. Like the idea of like this is this kind of crossroads of destiny kind of spirit. And I think this being its normal sized form is good. But there's probably stuff like that. That was always my interpretation of it, was that when she actually lightning bends at it in like the page after this, it is her defeating it, and that's why it's smaller later on, because she defeats it to get out of the vision. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to get out of it, because that's the only way, I guess, is that it's trying to force a redemption on her at this point. She chooses the other option, which is, what if I just defeated you? That's another way to break it. But the dialogue here is interesting. My manifestations didn't lie. So none of what is said to Azula is kind of blatantly wrong. And I think that's mainly meant to be when it talks about, say, look, like when I formed like Ursa, when I formed Ty Lee, the things that they said, like, they might not have been exactly what those characters would have said to you if they were actually here, but what they said about you isn't wrong. Like, we didn't just make up all that stuff. It was the truth. We were trying to help you choose a right path, and you chose not to do it. And you were offered the redemption, offered the chance at forgiveness, but I have, basically, you have chosen to kind of, in a way, reflect upon me, your kind of inner self, the underlying kind of hatred, cruelty, vengeance, and that's why I'm in this dark spirit form, is because what seems to be the case is that Azula is so, like, afraid, angry at the prospect of properly challenging herself on these things, that she gets properly angry, and this is why it gets reflected back on her. It's this idea, like, I have a bit of a discussion here on this, the idea of, the mention of monster in relation specifically to Azula. That again, Azula is the one who typically brings this up in relation to herself. Like, Azula has always mentioned this, and now this is the first time in a way anyone else has actually done that. She thinks her mother thought she was a monster, but we know it's not true. So that, combined with what the spirit says, seems to highlight that on a deep internal level, Azula actually thinks of herself as a monster. That's why there's that thematic thing going on with her character, it seems like, at all times. And I think this relates to, do I have it here? Yeah, I think it relates to sort of like what we eventually get to, the final things that, like, the spirit says to her through Zuko. Like, you surround yourself with people to manipulate and harm because you can't stand the idea of facing the world alone. Being alone would mean you'd have to deal with all the horrible things you've done, the way you've hurt people who cared for you. And you can see, like, she's taking this in, like, this is, like, hard hitting basically here. And the final line on the page following this is, "You're alone, Azula. No one to blame but yourself." And this is kind of what prompts, like, the question is then asked, do you want redemption and forgiveness? And she says no. She closes her eyes and blasts the spirit form of Zuko. And that's a really kind of telling kind of point, I think, is this is before she does the full I am princess of the Fire Nation. It's look at the way she answers. She closes her eyes, generating lightning, and just lashes out, not wanting to deal with it. Like, she answers the question, but it's like an automatic answer because there's a lot of truth. It's very hard hitting here. It's an armor piercing question here that is presented to her of like typically it's like, yeah, why do you want people around you? If you don't seem to care about people, then why do you always need to have a group around you? May Tai Li, you actually care about your family. Fire Warrior group, now you're going after another group. Why do you need all of that? It's because you're afraid of being alone. Why are you afraid of being alone? It's because you'd only have to reflect on yourself at that point, and you don't like having to do that. Because you know, in a way, this? Is that it? Is that the answer to this, really? That when she thinks about herself, no one else is around, she can't blame anyone else. She's like, I'm a monster. I think that's kind of what they're trying to get to here, a little bit with this whole arc, I think, for her. This is what it's about. This cycle is going to repeat itself until something changes it. It is about how she treats people. She feels betrayed by everyone, but why do they betray her? That's the kind of point in all of this. And then, we probably at this point have to tackle this. Let's get into Ozai and what's presented about this situation here. So, we finally get some focus on this a bit. So, we know from before, she views him as, like, weak. Since he doesn't have his bending anymore, he's in prison. Part of her plan doesn't seem to involve in any way breaking Ozai out or involving him in her plans. She's just kind of done with him in terms of the future. She views it as he's not strong anymore. He's weak. He was defeated for all time. But she also says this, that he's the only one who's not a traitor about Ozai. But then we get the reveal here of, like, to the Ursa vision, she says, like, you abandoned me. You weren't there to protect me from Dad. So I became what he wanted, his deadly firebending weapon. I didn't have a choice. So finally, like, this is a huge moment here, is that she actually finally, like, admits that, yes, what you all have assumed for a long time about this situation is actually true. That Ozai did forge Azula into his weapon, and that is why she is the way she is. But there's also this kind of question of, like, well, if you know this, if you can be aware enough of the situation to know he forged you into his weapon and he's always had this weird way of interacting with you, why can't you use that and change in a way? So it's that interesting situation of, like, she does acknowledge this, but what's interesting about it is that it's hidden amongst a lot of Ursa blaming that she does here. You abandoned me. This is the real reason. Like, that what's more important is that you didn't protect me from Dad, more so than what Ozai actually did. That's kind of what gets the focus here. It's that, like, the blame is shifted onto Ursa for the lack of protection rather than, like, specifically this. But she does finally acknowledge it. She then also says this, and obviously there's a lot to criticize of what she says here, if you just let Dad kill Zuko, you could have stayed with me, protected me from him, I wouldn't be this. And this is heartbreaking, like, in a way, the final bit there, I wouldn't be this. That's a very, like, open one, in terms of, like, she acknowledges that what she is not, like, correct, not right, whatever wording you want to have. She's aware that it's not ideal the way she is. Now, again, this is asking too much of Ursa. Like, the idea of, like, if you just let your son die to protect me. Whereas what she actually did allowed both of her children to survive. The sacrifice that kind of she had to make. So, and this is it. Like, she has this skewed view on this as well. That Ozai, despite being the core root of the issues, both with her and the family, he made Azula this way. But he also created the dynamic where Ursa has no power to protect Azula. So Ozai is responsible for, like, both sides of this dynamic being the way it is, at its core. But because he was loyal to her, because he was a constant in a way in her life, whereas her mother isn't, so many other people aren't, he gets the credit because he was always there. But what I find interesting about this is that when she talks about him, it is always about sort of, like, strength. It's about, like, loyalty. It's not about, like, care or, like, did she get love from Ozai that she didn't get elsewhere? Nothing gives us that impression, because based on what we know, Ozai had no love for anyone. That's Ursa's view on Ozai when she confronts him at the end of Smoke and Shadow. I'll actually get that scene here, because it's a really important one, I think, to note, because I think this is where you probably highlight the most that what Ursa says to Ozai in this scene is what Azula, like, isn't. What Ursa says to Ozai doesn't apply to Azula. Azula does care for people, Ozai doesn't. And so that's what's so powerful about, like, this scene where Ursa finally, you know, closes her eyes, breathes for a second, and then finally goes at Ozai and, you know, rips him apart for being weak in the kind of truest sense of the word. You know, what she says is, I see you. After all these years, I finally see you, Ozai. You're just a small man trying with all your might to be big. Your heart is so small, you've no room for your son, or your daughter, or your brother, or even yourself. Goodbye, Ozai. And he tries to criticize her, but she walks off. His power doesn't work on her anymore. And I think the point in this is sort of like, they confirm there, he had no love for anyone in his family. Azula clearly does, but she's very conflicted about what to do with that, because I think she thinks, because she was raised by Ozai deep down, that she kind of has to be like him and kind of not have those feelings, like, push them down, when the idea is, no, embrace them. And I think I pointed this out somewhere in this document, don't I? Do I have this here? Yeah, like one of the big conclusions. Like, it's a very broad way of looking at her arc, but this is what Azula needs to do. This is the growth that she needs to get. If she's to properly progress and kind of be where she needs to be, it's just this kind of idea. She needs to learn to gain people's trust through kind of love and friendship. She needs to understand this word a bit better. That's the kind of core of it. Which is why, of course, as we know, like, this moment, which is even referenced in this comic, the idea of May's love for Zuko breaking her control is such a big topic. So, that's that. yeah, like that is the truth of it. Is that like yes, praise for strength, prowess, cruelty, and all that stuff is all that she knows. Yeah. Um. But let's get back down here. Where are we here? We have the firebending scene to go over still. We'll get to that shortly. Oh yeah, we were on Ozai. Did I finish it? Yeah. She, you know, she doesn't talk about her father's love. He had no love for everyone. He gave Azula like focus and attention, but to make her a weapon, meaning she never got what she actually wanted. And I think that's the thing. Like, she can look back on him as like a constant in her life. There was someone who was there for her in some way, but not the right ways. But how will she react when she finally gets what she actually wanted? Which is sort of why up here again. Where are we here? Like stuff like this. Zuko being like, I want to help you, like I want my sister in my life, has an emotional impact on her. It's why this scene has an impact on her. Is because this is like effectively in this moment kind of like a stranger kind of being like, this is the kind of truth of the situation, and it's still hitting her just as hard. So that's the kind of reality of the situation there. And yeah, Ozai not part of the plan. So she's, again, that's the complicated thing, is of like she's done with Ozai, but she's done with him for the reasons Ozai is done with other people. So like the question is like, does Azula need to have a conversation with Ozai, a la Ursa and Ozai, or is that not a good idea? That's kind of where my conflict is in this, is that it feels like there's still something that needs to be resolved between her and her father, but I'm like, I don't know if she's maybe ready to have that. I think a lot needs to happen before she has a confrontation scene with Ozai herself. She spent so much time alone with Ozai that she doesn't understand how to either give or receive love in a healthy manner. Yes, that's probably a really good way of putting it, is that like, that is a large part of why, going back up to what we started off with, why this scene is so interesting for her. She tries to be normal with a relationship, but doesn't know how to do it because Ozai doesn't know that either, and of course he didn't teach her that. She doesn't have a clue how to interact with people normally, where she's not commanding people to be close to her or anything like that. This is what she misses out on. Overall, it's an interesting one. Azula's last meeting with Ozai was in the search. Yes, I believe it was. So I have the search here. Now, when was this last one? Is it right at the start here? Yeah, like they're basically kind of, I suppose, showing it like here in the early pages of this, which sets up the whole plot to actually happen. So we don't really know what was talked about, but based on what actually happens, what it seems like is just, it's this last ditch attempt by Ozai to have some sort of an influence on anything. But I think once she realizes the kind of truth of the matter later on in the book, she realizes like, oh yeah, he has no strength, no power. I'll do my own thing. And that's part of like her kind of growth in between the search and Smoke and Shadow, is kind of moving on from that. So very, very key things kind of going on here. But yeah, we'll get to I think this might be one of the last things, the Azula discovered to be a firebender scene here. This one here. This is fantastic. I love this scene. Um, did Ozai instruct Azula to go after Ursa and take her out? Because that's the feeling I'm getting. This is like the search is actually a complicated plot, but like the idea was like what Ozai basically gave her instructions on where to basically find the letter Ursa had written to Ikem Noran about the whole Zuko is your father is actually him and not Ozai, and the idea is, well, this is a way, Azula, for you to gain the throne. You can use this letter to prove that Zuko is not actually a rightful member of the royal family, let alone the heir to the throne. You make that letter public and suddenly we have a bit of a kind of plan going on. That was effectively what happened, and then kind of from there, through the investigation, they came across Ursa. I think Ursa attacks. Sorry, Azula attacks Ursa. I don't think it's necessarily part of the plan. I think it's just a lot of Azula's conflicted feelings. This is where like I probably do need to go back and reread in full the details about this. Like, let me actually just try and find one of the first scenes where this happens. Yeah, because it takes until like right towards the end of the book for it's this moment where like Azula is literally talking to the Mother of Faces, where we get the full-on reveal about Ursa being Noriko. So it's only at that point when she even finds this out. So I don't think it was ever like necessarily part of the plan, because like Ozai has no clue the details specifically of what has happened to Ursa, kind of beyond just that she got away. Because again, like that was part of the plot, was I think like what after the banishment he I'm getting that bit confused. But he doesn't really know or kind of particularly care, because the deal they effectively created keeps her away basically. So that's that. But yeah, then yeah, this scene, the firebender scene, I love this because a lot of it is like the art. I think the art is fantastic on this panel about the emotion that this gets across from Ursa on the complexity of this scene. And it's the idea of Ozai is super, super happy about this because he has his weapon, he has his prodigal firebender. But Ursa is trying to judge this line between, I don't want to like dash my daughter's excitement about this notable thing that has happened to her, but also I know this is the moment I kind of lose her and can't really stop this path that I know is going to happen. That he is going to focus on you and morph you to kind of become like him, and there's so little power or ability that I have to stop this from happening, that unfortunately you being discovered to be a firebender, you are happy, but I can only see the kind of bad aspects of it. And so this is why Azula looks back on this scene and gets this kind of mixed response in a way of like, yeah, why was she acting so weird? Why wasn't she happy? Everyone else was happy. Why was it like this? But then we get this really interesting scene of like this, where the reality of it is the scared, fearful Ursa. And then the spirit shows like an ideal version of this. Like, oh, you want your mother to be happy in this scene. But look how creepy, in a way, Ursa looks with the smile on her face in this scene. Because the reality that can't ever change in this scene is Ursa's reality within that moment. So her being happy about what's about to happen isn't real and kind of comes across as being creepy. This is a really good scene, of course. And then the reaction, of course, is really strong as well. My mother wasn't happy because I was a firebender. She was afraid for me, afraid of me. And it's like, which one? But the fact that Azula says both is super interesting. And the question comes up of like, in a way, which one was it? Because the afraid of me is the interpretation of Ursa where she thinks I'm a monster, which we know isn't true. So afraid for me fits what's actually going on here. But that's what's so good about the scene, is because you can look at it from all of these situations. Is that like, yeah, Azula can want the better reaction from her mother, but the reality means that that can't ever happen. The Ursa kind of perspective in this scene is, I think, very, very clear. The relationship between these two, I think, is very, very interesting. And overall, like, it's probably my favorite scene in the book. And I think it's just, this is what you really do to highlight the writing within this book, is this. Do we know how old Azula is in this scene? I know she's somewhere between 6 and 8 when Ursa leaves. Oh god, the age stuff is so confusing. Like, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. Because in this scene as well, this is when she's first discovered to be a firebender. So this is actually like one of the earliest scenes that we have of Azula as well. So this is like even before some of that stuff, I'd guess. I'm assuming it's like 5 or 6 years old, something like that, because of the whole idea of like she's discovered to be a firebender in relative control at such an early age. But it's meant to kind of represent the idea of like it's at this point, in a way, this early is how kind of things kind of really went awry here. Yeah, but yeah, there's a bit of a discussion going on in the chat about like what is the typical age that characters should discover that they are a bender, because we have, oh god, I'm misremembering all my ages of characters in specific scenes here. Korra is 4 in that opening scene, isn't she? I think that's the details there. In that opening scene, like, I'm the Avatar, you got to deal with it. I think Korra is meant to be 4, and that's her, like, you know, with a little bit of, you know, 3 of the 4 elements. Ki, we get to see her firebend for the first time, and Ki is about what, 5 or 6 as well. That's kind of an interesting one. Otherwise, like, do we really have that many examples of other? Yeah, I don't think we really have any other examples of like when characters got bending for the first time outside of avatars learning kind of like secondary third elements. So it does seem to be the case where, I guess, if you're meant to view some of those other characters as being prodigies, then the norm is probably that you're maybe like 7 or 8 maybe, and you discover you're a bender. Maybe even as late as like 9, 10, that's maybe like, okay. After that, it's one of those ones where like there's obviously questions that you have about like, are there situations where like people only discover they have bending when they're like a full-on teenager, or they only discover they're a bender in adulthood and it's not like a harmonic convergence situation. You sort of wonder a lot of those questions about like, yeah, like what if it just goes unnoticed for like a large amount of time? What do we do then? Now, let's take a look through the book here. Are there other scenes that I want to highlight? Because I don't think we've really talked much about the specifics that she says to most of the visions. Ozai said he didn't see the spark of a firebender in Zuko's eyes. Like, did he say that just to be mean, or is that really a thing? There probably is some sort of a thing where, like, if you are like a master firebender, you probably can get a sense from someone, even if they're young, that they have a like innate inner fire. Him saying something about Zuko obviously is going to be biased because he specifically chose to treat Zuko poorly, basically just to make Ursa upset for so much of their relationship. But it does seem to be the case that he did basically abandon, not focus on Zuko because he wasn't initially a skilled firebender. Because that is the truth about like Zuko, is that he is a late bloomer as a bender. He gets to a really high level, but it is from 16 onwards where most of that actually happens. And before that, he really kind of isn't anywhere. So I guess it's just that he doesn't see that immediate kind of like prodigal sense within him. Some of that might also just be analysis of like his personality. That like Ozai is just like, you are not the typical royal family member. You are not a maybe even typical firebender in terms of your personality. And there's all those kind of things that kind of come into play, I think, as well. But yeah, what else do we have here? Oh yeah, there's this line from Azula about Ozai. She says, now he's a pathetic shadow of his former self. His bending is gone, taken by the Avatar. So she does, like, at the same time view him as pathetic, but also has these complicated feelings on him. So that's interesting. But yeah, I think it probably is the stuff that May, and probably more specifically Ty Lee, say to her in the book that I think is quite interesting. Yeah, the whole idea of like, why have you joined the Kyoshi Warriors? Like, you were better as part of our team, doing what we were doing. And the Ty Lee vision talking about how, I wear this clothing because this is what the Kyoshi Warriors wear. All I remember from my time as part of your team was constant anxiety and stress and anxiety. And that is an interesting one to talk about, because then in the later scene, it also gets mentioned the idea of, like, I loved being part of the circus, and I would have been happy to stay there. Like, but like you threatened my life effectively to force me to join the team. That is an interesting one because it's true, and sure, you could also make the point that there was some element of like positivity with the team kind of coming back together. But I think it's just representative of a lot of these groups that Azula ends up forming, where they're meant to be friends, but she's treating them as like a small military outfit. and eventually the anxiety begins to grow because the focus on a day-to-day basis is mission, 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 not really caring about what they want to do necessarily, just, you're part of my team now. That's what we're doing. That's the kind of interesting contrast there. And it's one of those interesting ones. Do you guys think that in the future Azula will get on with Aang and be friendly with him the way Zuko is? It's hard to imagine. It's one of those ones where, like, she doesn't ever have to be, like, best friends with Aang, but she can be friendly with him. Like, we've seen that already to a certain extent. Like, in The Search, there are moments where Azula just has, like, a little bit of a back and forth with the different members of Team Avatar. Yes, it's intercut with, like, fighting and stuff like that, and the whole situation, tension throughout that book, but there are bits and pieces where you can see, like, her dynamic with them. Of, like, it seems like fundamentally there are big differences in personalities there, where, like, she just doesn't like the lovey-dovey Aang Katara relationship, and she's never going to be on the same exact wavelength as both of those characters. But, you know, depending on where she ends up, like advisor to the Fire Lord, that would put her in a pseudo-world leader-esque role. She'd have to have somewhat of a friendly relationship with the Avatar, you would assume. And in a way, that's really all that's needed. For Azula, it's Ursa, Zuko, Mei, Ty Lee. They're the main characters that you assume she needs to have a dynamic with. Obviously, add in Noren, Ki. Really want to see the Ki dynamic, actually. Like, that is a really interesting one in terms of, like, I hope Ki gets a focus in whatever they're going to do. I do feel what they said on that podcast that time, one of the few times Mike and Brian have ever talked about Avatar Studios and the whole idea of, you know, kind of in a way continuity, and that the comics, they're not going to do adaptations, but that you will, or was this one of those Braving the Elements things? Either way, one of the people who's involved in Avatar Studios mentioned something along the lines of, if you have read the comics, you will gain an understanding about certain things, certain characters that are included in Avatar Studios content. And I think most people interpreted them the way they said that as being Ki. Ki is the most obvious, like, character who is related to main characters who doesn't exist if you don't read the comics. So, like, Ki's going to, I guess, have to come into play. And I think there's some very interesting stuff that they could do if they involved her in the dynamic. But there's that. But yeah, the Ty Lee Azula dynamic, yeah, there's definitely a closeness there, but I guess under it all, I guess they both realize that with Azula, it's probably just one of those things where, like, it's hard to consistently maintain that dynamic on a day-to-day basis when Azula acts the way she does. That they can handle a certain amount of Azula, but then they need to live their own lives and stuff like that. So that really is what it comes down to. And I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how they kind of come back around to kind of doing more with that. But what else do we have here? Yeah, what May ends up saying, you tell the people around you they're nothing without you, that they can't survive without you. And that is the kind of truth of, like, she tries to make it out that, like, you benefit from being with me, when the actual kind of truth of the situation is probably actually more that Azula deep down needs them. That the impression I get is that, like, if Azula had to do her kind of book 2 stuff without her team, she would have had a meltdown without kind of May and Ty Lee being there as, like, competent people that she actually kind of cares about, that's around her. That's the kind of impression I get, is that, in a way, like, look at those early episodes before she has the team and the whole Tides Command the ship thing, the guy being like, take the prisoners on board, and the mistakes being made. But that's just the depth going on here. Yes, there is the mention there in chat of Smoke and Shadow. And the little backstory scene with Ursa. Oh, I get so confused with all these characters. Backstory scene with May, Ty Lee, and Azula. Now, where is this? Wait, which section is this in? Oh, here we go. Yeah, right towards the end. Yeah, well, page 189 of the omnibus. Finally get there. Let's see, what do we have here? Remember that sleepover that we all had at your place, referring to May? The time you made me steal mochi from my mom, I remember. And she's like, made you, please. You give me too much credit, May. I merely suggested it. You're the one who insisted on going through with it. But afterwards you wouldn't touch it at all. Ty Lee was worried about negative energies, so I had to eat it all by my lonesome. So, yeah. So yeah, it highlights the kind of bad influence of Azula, but that they had a sleepover together, which is interesting. And Azula obviously reflects back on it kind of in a different way. Definitely adds to the whole, like, kind of, we're talking about the nobility thing and what happened with the Fire Warriors, is that, like, May's response to this happening is definitely kind of in line with that, definitely. And yeah, this is when she gets to the whole, the scene I have in the document here of, like, the Kamura Kage, and this is what May was afraid of in the past. So, and when was that? Because is that actually maybe the youngest of Azula we've ever seen? Because they seem pretty young there. Either way, like, that kind of highlights, because in terms of timeline, obviously the idea is that this scene, the discovery as a firebender scene, this will be the time at which the Ozai influence from this point on then becomes very, very heavy. But the question is, does that sleepover scene happen before or after this? Like, how long have May and Ty Lee known Azula is sort of like the bigger question of, like how young is this in relation to when they go to school together, basically. That's kind of the question. It's hard to say. Doesn't matter too much, because if it's before, what that tells us is that Azula was a troublemaker prior to heavy Ozai influence because of Azula being a prodigal firebender. So it kind of changes it slightly, whereas like if that scene, if the sleepover scene happens afterwards, then it sort of obviously is like, okay, well, it's the Ozai influence that made her that way, made her do that kind of thing. But I don't know, like I at least to a certain degree, I've always interpreted it that just Azula was always at least mischievous as a character. Always had a little bit of that kind of slight kind of edge, kind of cruelty there underlying. Not to the extent that I think Ozai kind of eventually made it go that way, but I don't know. It depends on like what way you view the character, because you probably don't want to go down the path where like the entirety of who Azula is formed entirely by Ozai. Like you have to have something that is Azula that's not just Ozai, basically. So just an interesting one. So there's that, and then like what we have a lot of those like flashback scenes, like the ones that like happen throughout Zuko's story, where it's like, oh, like Liu Ten's in it, but then like there's a very young Zuko there, so that means like baby Azula should be here. Like there were some decent times in the family. Like it very much comes across as being a kind of Yukon family situation where like there was a chance at happiness, but then the bending came in and Ozai kind of did what he did, of course. And that's the distinction there of like that is the kind of negative side of bending with the kind of wrong characters is of course the Yukon situation, but the royal family situation is also the same. Because like I said earlier, like the whole reason Ursa is part of this family is because she's forced into it by Azulon and all this planning, because they just want a strong bloodline for the royal family because of bending ability, basically. So Azula, being as talented as she is the success of the project, basically. This is why Ozai is so happy, is that project, Roku bloodline has worked because Azula is that skilled. That's the situation there. And that's of course the kind of brutal aspect of Ursa, where she gets these kids which are super important to her, but because of Ozai, she kind of has so little control over them, and so she does the best she can to protect Zuko, to try and rein Azula in the little moments that she can. But there's also the idea that like if Azula kind of in a way reports back to her father that like, oh, mom is telling me not to do this, and this, Azula's going to bring Ozai down on her, and it's going to just create that kind of cycle of the whole issue in the first place. And we know that's the whole situation. But then like Azulon is involved. Like this is where it goes back. Like Azulon, in response to Ozai asking the question of like give me the birthright, asks Ozai to kill his own son, and you realize that like, yeah, this is just the way it was in those families because of the competitiveness. And so the fact that sort of we know that there are some good eggs who kind of come out of this lineage is an amazing thing to happen. The fact that like Iro is able to kind of turn his kind of life around, but even like tragedy happens there. Zuko comes out of it. Ursa gets out of it eventually. we seem to have like characters like Princess Zaysan in the kind of past who are kind of like this. There's some interesting dynamics, of course. Yeah, again, the idea here. What does it mean to be worthy of the throne in Azula's mind? Power. And that is literally just raw power rather than the true strength of a good like leader, which is something Ozai, I guess, doesn't properly understand. Zuko as kind of is coming to understand. And in a way, like that's kind of part of the plot of like, say, like the promise and stuff like that, is that like Zuko struggling with that decision making, goes to his father trying to get advice about how to lead, and Zuko ultimately in the end decides that no, I can't follow that path of just make decisions just because I'm the Fire Lord. And he obviously improves at his decision making, but he's never going to be like the most amazing character at it. But that's the fact that he continues to try and do the best that he can despite the kind of struggles is the strength of like Zuko in the kind of leadership position, and knowing that he will go on to help to form United Republic and stuff like that is part of that legacy. And at least that's one thing that we know going forward, is that as far as we are aware, the evil legacy of Fire Lords ends as of basically now going forward. Azula and where she ends up is kind of really the last remnant of that. Is like, if we can get her to a position where she isn't a chaotic entity out there doing villainous acts at times, we've changed that family line going forward, because Azumi is a peaceful Fire Lord, Fire Lady, whatever way you want to call it, of the Fire Nation. Iro too, very reasonable character. There doesn't seem to be any obvious suggestion of something happening again, because the implication is that, assuming Azumi does have a daughter, and there is some like concept of who will be the Fire Lord after Azumi, that kind of almost feels like it's resolved with the idea that like Iro seems to be devoted to the military, and he could stick with the military and not take up the role, but they would need to introduce the Azumi daughter character to make that plot point work overall. But yeah, I do often go back to scenes like this and be like, yeah, the Zuko alone, Azula alone basically moment. This feels clear that like there's something more coming, and it'll be interesting to see this, especially this, looking back on this with a lot of the other dialogue in the book. It's like referencing Phoenix King, highlighting Ozai, interestingly. And then I find it interesting, Zuko does mention his mother and father, whereas Azula doesn't mention Ursa. So like there is that. So the idea of like they need to talk. But as we see here, she is afraid. And in a way, like this is kind of what's so good about this scene, is she's criticizing Zuko for being weak here by wanting to talk to Azula and figure stuff out. But Azula's the one who runs away from her feelings in this scene. And that's what's so interesting. There's the complexity of like, because Ozai doesn't know how to, in a way, deal with his own feelings, because he's implied to basically have none, Azula doesn't know how to do the same. But Azula does have feelings. And there's your core difference. There's your core difference and why there's still hope for Azula, and why I don't think you can give up on a character, at the very least, one, because she's still very young. There's a huge difference between Ozai and Ursa in so many ways, age and all these other points, but there's all these little details here. Let's see. Will Zuko send double agents to become some of Azula's followers? I doubt he's gonna go that far. I think he knows he probably needs to just directly kind of confront her, and that's kind of the way to end this in sort of the safest way possible. It does sort of feel to a certain degree like they probably do have to have like another fight and see kind of exactly how that goes. But we'll see how exactly they play that, obviously. Yeah, this is the big question here, I suppose. Like, I'll bring this up here as a topic at the end here. It's like, okay, that I think is the big question here that needs to be answered for Azula is this. This was Azula on her own, with a spirit who was able to sort of almost like, through its own powers and kind of illusions, push you onto the right path. That wasn't enough. Azula on her own, with this kind of construct way of making it happen. So what's actually going to make it happen? Like, obviously there are some things that are going to happen, like talk with Ursa. Like, that has to happen, but how do you get there? Because Azula, it seems like, doesn't want to make that happen. If she did, she could probably just appear before Ursa at any point. So you do have to almost, it feels like, force a situation where they come into contact with each other. Now, the idea is obviously that like Azula will turn up at some point in the future with a new group in a new something like that. And it's like, we deal with this. We have to deal with Azula and her new group. The one that she's going to form based on the end of the book. Where's the final page again? Yeah. I'll find new followers, a new place to rule. So she does say a new place to rule. So does that mean Fire Nation, Fire Island? Is she going to the Earth Kingdom? Where? So it opens the door to some differences to happen. So she'll turn up somewhere, and like eventually, Zuko will want to like just end the chaos of Azula's meddling. Like, that seems very kind of like reasonable, and that Zuko will just decide it's time to end this. Maybe because Azula is actually planning to do something bigger. Because we get it talked about as just they're causing like little bits of chaos, mischief. It's a nuisance, but not a massive problem, because it seems like the Kamurakage kind of a kid kidnapping plot, that isn't the norm for what they were doing. They were attacking kind of grain distribution silos and stuff like this, little bits and pieces that would annoy and maybe prompt Zuko to act, but nothing maybe really has in a major way. But then what? You get Zuko out there with some of the other characters. You assume Ty Lee is at the very least there. Again, a lot of this kind of gets complicated because of sort of like, May and Zuko's relationship, and like we assume they will be back together in a time skip story, because there's that whole thing, because like, how do you get May into the field with Zuko if they're not in a relationship? It makes sense with Ty Lee because she is a Kyoshi warrior, and part of her duties seem to be, as like a Fire Nation kind of member of the Kyoshi warriors, to act as Zuko's bodyguard. So it makes sense how Ty Lee and Zuko will be in or around Azula on some sort of a mission. May, who I do think you probably need there, you have to do some explanation based on where we are in the comics right now, and other plot points that have been ongoing for a very, very long time. So there's that. And then I guess it's just, if they capture her, the big but these forced don't seem to work. So there is that situation of like like we kind of discussed a little bit earlier, the idea of like, if they capture her, it's a way to make the scenes happen, but based on the Spirit Temple stuff, these forced situations aren't exactly what we necessarily... It's not maybe going to work. Now, the difference is, of course, actual Ursa is going to say different things than Spirit Vision version of Ursa to Azula. And we know from previous scenes I've talked about many times in this video that Ursa and some of the things that she says to Azula can draw out the emotions of Azula. But it almost feels too simplistic here in a way. So that's why, like I was discussing earlier on, the idea of like, if Azula sees like, engineer some sort of a situation like this where, in the chaos of everything happening, one of these characters is in danger of dying. None of the hero characters can get to them, but Azula can get there in time. Does she step in to save her friends from something happening? Because there is suddenly a massive kind of door opening scene, because there is the suddenly like Azula following her feelings. I like kind of my body moved on its own type thing to protect someone who, in a way, all these characters have issues to a certain degree with her. They kind of wouldn't expect her to do it. She wouldn't expect herself to do it. But what if it happened? That would be a huge moment to almost just prove to herself that she can do it. Like Azula saving Ty Lee definitely I think could work. I almost feel like these two is maybe the one that it would work better with, like her defending her mother from something happening, or Ty Lee. I think that they'll do something with Ty Lee before May, I think. Defending Zuko, you could make it work, but we'll see. That's a way to do it. Otherwise, like, what other elements do we have at play here? There's some way to use Ozai if you really wanted to, but I think that's probably something that happens later if you even have it happen at all. Because like it's the question of sort of what other key dynamic can you actually do? Like, is Azula going to react to a big display of Zuko being an excellent leader as he is without Azula's influence on the situation? She seems to almost just dance around that kind of concept. So the other way to do this is probably like, Azula in danger. Like, Ursa protecting her. That's one way to do it. Is like that. There's a huge moment of like, if Azula ever gets in a situation where she's in trouble, and her mother is just there on the battlefield for whatever reason, and she comes running in front of something that's about to happen to Azula. That's a big kind of statement moment, because what I think you need to happen is just like in a real scene, just like Ursa saying she loves Azula. Like that is the core point. It's simple, but like it's an impactful thing. And it's like, it feels like to some degree, like, is there an apology in there as well? There probably maybe should be to make this kind of work, because the whole point in the book in a way is like, oh, so do you want to force situations where you get the people who betrayed you to apologize to you? But if Ursa just offers that normally, that's something. That's certainly something. It's just creating the right situation is the situation of like what puts Azula in this danger. Because if it's Zuko and everyone else hunting her down, I don't think you want some sort of a situation where like Ursa stepping in between Azula and Zuko, and you're framing Zuko as maybe doing something wrong. So it feels like you maybe have to have another enemy in there somewhere. That's something. And yeah, like, again, this can work with like Ty Lee, May, Zuko to a certain degree. A danger of Azula's own making. So yeah, it's sort of the idea of like, Azula like creates a group she can't control. I'll say like group. She can't control, and the lack of control is not like them leaving her because she doesn't care. Like a situation where the group just by their own power basically breaks that control that Azula would typically have over a group. She like properly loses control, and it's not like the same situation as other things where it's about May's love for Zuko. It's Ty Lee then protecting May. Those type of situations. It's just, what if her new team got out of control and became a real danger to everyone in the vicinity. That's a way to do it. Again, like, we're not writing a full kind of set piece here, but there's a lot of these situations that I think need to happen, and it's kind of that idea of, in the aftermath of this, like, you can have a big moment happen in the kind of heart of a battle or whatever, but it's what Azula, I think, really needs is just like a week at home with her family where she's not doing leadership commanding stuff. And I think that's the real thing for her, of like, in the last couple of years, how many like days has she had where she can just be sort of a little bit more like relaxed, full stop. And you kind of really think about it, and it's like, it feels like one of the last times for this is like this Ember Island, family vacations in years past, the times before she was discovered to be a firebender. It's like everything after that has been master your firebending, learn to control people, learn to be the best, like, Fire Lord, Phoenix Queen, or whatever like that you can be, and manipulate people. And it's just like, she just probably needs that moment with like her family, and sort of like, you know, effectively, like, you know, like, it's that sort of basic idea there of like, this stuff is kind of what you feel like that's going to be so meaningful to her if she finally makes that step forward, when whatever way it happens. The idea of like, she gets like brought home or whatever, and suddenly there's a supportive family. Like, in a way, the ideal family is there. It's just different than what she kind of thought. This is the chance for that to kind of be that way, basically. So, because that's the really interesting point. Because if she could really turn it around, it's like Azula Key, I think, is like a super interesting dynamic. Like, I really like the idea that her having like a little sister, and kind of in a way maybe she's the one who maybe helps her with her firebending training, because maybe she's also a prodigy like Azula. That could be an interesting thing to kind of have this, like, you know, the other characters help out, of course, but like Azula is the main one maybe helping with this. Would be kind of interesting overall. And then yet Norrin, like, it's tough to imagine they kind of properly utilize him in like Avatar Studios material properly. But I think it feels like, okay, her mother's going to be huge to kind of have back in her life, but Norrin, if they do it correctly, also could be like really, really huge for her to have as well. But like, are they going to have the time to do this? Because for this to happen, like, you have to have a movie that basically is a full-on, like, royal family drama series or movie. Like, you have to give time for, like, all of these characters to shine, for sure. And then we probably should, before we wrap the stream, Iro and Azula. The Iro and Azula dynamic is always an interesting one, because people will, I think, often very, very heavily highlight, certain scenes from the show as being like, these two hate each other type thing. Where, like, because Iro was Zuko's mentor, and he said, "Oh, Azula is crazy, she needs to go down," that means Iro inherently doesn't like Azula and doesn't, like, see the potential. But I don't think it means as much as that. I do think overall it would be weird to overly emphasize Iro as being a huge, like, as playing a huge role in Azula's growth. But you would like to see something overall. But I think the idea that we have is sort of the idea that I think this is what Arnie has said about this arc in terms of very, very early kind of ideas, is the idea that, like, what Azula's arc would be more complicated than Zuko's, but Zuko would be the one kind of helping her along the way. And I think they could do that. And so the idea is Zuko has learned from Iro. And because Iro doesn't have as much of a connection to Azula, it doesn't make sense to do that one. So instead, Zuko gets to play a little bit of that role, combined with, I guess, in Azula's case, it would be probably an arc combined across a lot of different characters. But, you could see the idea of, like, a key scene when Azula is maybe in a slightly better mindset. She actually maybe for once listens to Iro, and he might have something important to say to her at a key moment that would really, really help her. That I think will be a kind of interesting one. But it just speaks to the sort of idea of, like, it still feels like, Iro Ozai is a dynamic I'd like to see some more on, and maybe him talking to her about this would be kind of interesting, about his view on Ozai, in the same way that he kind of helps Ursa build up the courage almost to have that confrontation with Ozai. Maybe something there. There's also the idea of, like, going back here. Because these two are so, like, highly regarded as firebenders, and kind of in a way are so prodigal in terms of, like, Iroh's created certain skills, Azula has the blue fire, is able to learn stuff really quickly. Like, there's the idea that you kind of feel like, just even on just this sense of, like, him teaching her some stuff would be kind of a bit of an interesting dynamic. But like I said, I'm not sure if this is the dynamic that's necessarily going to be the focus, but you'd like to see something out of this overall. So yeah, that's basically that. Anything else there? Other characters, like, are they going to use Katara? Probably not. Sokka? Probably not. Suki? Toph? Now, I don't really think it's one of those ones where, like, Team Avatar get particularly heavily involved in this. It does feel like you have to give this arc to the family, to kind of do the family and friends basically. But we'll have to wait and see what they really do there. That's actually an interesting one. Yeah, Lo and Lee. Like, are these two important to her, like, at all? Probably hard to find a super heavy way to use them, but it's an interesting idea. I think the big thing is just like I hope they have a plan for Azula. This comic was great, but like, this is the real reality in the aftermath of this comic. Is this was good, but like there needs to be more. Like, this is not enough to kind of go off for 7 years. The hope you would have is that, like, it is so well written, it feels like they have been recently planning like, that's kind of the impression I get, that like it feels like a particularly notable character piece, such that they must have had some of these ideas in play to be kind of immediately used. Just because like it does feel very different in terms of just that kind of like character quality writing than some of the other comics. It feels like, did they give this one a little bit more attention because it was Azula? And why would they do that if they don't have a plan? That's the thing. Is just like, yeah. Yeah, they just they need to talk. They need to announce their stuff. We need to get the announcement probably on the first 2 or 3 projects. I think at some point next year, I'm guessing, is when like they're gonna have to say something. We have the first movie, but again, there's no title for it yet, so they're gonna have to give that one a title sooner rather than later. If they have a first series on the go, they need to announce that at some point, because obviously the rumors are saying that's 2025 as well, but like we've heard nothing officially about that. Obviously the rumors are saying it's that Earth Avatar After Korra series, but again, officially nothing has been said about a series. But all of the talk that we have heard from like the high ups at Paramount in relation to Avatar is that multimedia approach, movies and shows, is very much still the plan, still on the cards, but we need to actually see what they're planning to do. So yeah, we need to see that. And it's like, yeah, Azula needs a movie, Azula needs a mini series, something like that. It honestly does kind of feel like, yeah, the show, like a mini series, is probably what's maybe the better option than a movie, because a movie gives you somewhat limited time, whereas the series gives you, I think, a little bit more stuff to work with. Let's see. Okay, let's see. What's this? Avatar Studios, like MCU. yeah, like this has come up a lot since we got the reveal here. Um, I understand the core concept of why people say this, because there's sort of a worry in general in the industry of, are we turning too much of this from sort of like the artistry of this movie means something, this series means something, and are we turning it into content? But the problem here is just like, it's basically like Avatar Studios, like what? Like we know nothing. Like we have nothing. Like it feels like we're lucky every year if we get like a comic, a novel. We used to have years where we would get 2-3 comics. Now we're getting one and hoping that we get an announcement. Like, I find it hard to fully be concerned when we have not had an Avatar like big project since 2014. And because the universe is already pre-established as generational through the way the Avatar works, I don't think we have the same concerns that kind of Marvel has. Whereas Marvel, what it's probably suffering from at the moment is just that their initial Avengers lineup was great. They moved on some of the characters, and even though they kind of did what they needed to do to fill in the gaps, they kind of forgot to build to something, and now they're in this weird situation where they just have like, they're so wide, and it's like we're kind of building to something, but now we don't really know, and it's like, what is the big Avengers team going to be? What's the makeup of that team? Are we going to care about all those characters when we get to it? Whereas I think there's an inherent interest in just, we're doing a thing and it's about this Avatar. We're now over here and it's a Korra project. We're over here and it's a Kyoshi project. Here's another Avatar project. There's, because the universe is so untapped and there's so much room to work with, you can make every project feel unique if they give it the attention. And I think Avatar needs more stuff. And I would not be worried at all about this. At least now, especially now, when we don't... especially now when we don't know basically anything. Like, I think most of us are in a situation where we dream of being like, asking the question, slow down a little bit. Like, you're never going to hear me these days saying, I think they're putting out too many comics. I think they're putting out too much Avatar stuff. That seems like a preposterous thing to say right now. And it's like, we're nowhere near this point just yet. Sure, the rumored kind of plan is a bit crazy when you look at it. Like, what is it? Like, Team Avatar movie 2025. Earth Avatar show also 2025. Another movie 2026. Apparently another brand new show 2026. And then like 2027, another movie. 2027, like another show, but it's like a different style of show. And that doesn't even factor in the idea of maybe a season 2 of one of the other ones and stuff like that. It is a bit crazy to think about. Like, we don't know how we're going to feel a year or two into Avatar Studios, and we're getting a series every year, a series every 2 years. But I do think Avatar is sort of unique with the way it works, because it does have the different eras. Star Wars kind of has a bit of that, but they don't use it enough. I think Disney have benefited from being more willing to utilize like the prequel era in a lot of their recent projects in recent years, after effectively abandoning it in the early years of taking over the franchise. They're going to try to kind of reignite interest in the sequel trilogy stuff going forward. And now they're kind of making the decision of like, oh yeah, let's do some ancient kind of Star Wars lore stuff, and maybe they'll finally do like an Old Republic thing and like utilize like the breadth of things you can do with Star Wars. But I think that's already like right there with Avatar. Once they don't fall into the trap of being stuck to ATLA, I think if there's maybe a fear, that could be it. But I think knowing Mike and Brian, I think they won't do that. I don't think they maybe would have agreed to all this stuff if we're going to be too locked into ATLA. But we definitely want to see like when is the first project that's not Aang era. We definitely need more Aang content. I think that's fair to say. Like, it is the correct decision, I think, for the franchise to start off with ATLA. But I definitely want to know that the past avatars are in play early on, to show what we're actually about. Because I think it would probably be a mistake to be like, first project ATLA, maybe second project ATLA, third one is Korra, and it takes until the fourth or fifth project to actually do uniqueness. But even that said, I don't think many people are going to complain too much that we get more Avatar content that we've needed for a while. It's clear from kind of the reaction to Korra that a lot of people did want just ATLA characters older, lots of it. There's a lot of stuff that you can still do. A lot of people want to see what's next for Korra, and there's a lot of room to work with because there's no set in stone endpoint for Korra. You can go as long as we want because we don't know when the Korra era comes to an end. But they should use the strength that they have, and that they're doing it with the novels. But even the novels have their limitations because they have to use the characters when they're like YA. And that's another thing, is like, we probably, in terms of maybe fatigue, maybe need to worry a little bit about that, perhaps. About the kind of, every avatar, we have to focus on teenage avatar. Whereas I kind of like to see like direct focus for like a series or a full movie on like an adult avatar. We're getting that with the first movie. That's a positive, that they don't feel they have to do teenage Aang. But you know, there's that sort of stuff that will be interesting to see what they do. Depends on how many projects they're doing, of course. But we just have to trust that they have the plan. Let's see, I think Juan was like 1920. Yeah, he's, what is it? He's 20, like the post time skip stuff, and is it just a year at the start with that? 18. Okay, so yeah, he spends 2 years in the wilderness. So like he's 18, then he's 20. But yeah, Korra in book 4 would be the kind of oldest like proper focus given to an avatar. So like even just continuing her story would be kind of interesting. But yeah, on this it's just like they have sort of Feb, March. in terms of big Avatar Studios news, we would be expecting some, I think, next year. And these are really the options I think we have. Kind of February, March for the kind of investors event / Paramount up front. I'm assuming at the very least we'll have to get like some mention of the Avatar movie here, as in like this is an upcoming thing within the next kind of year and a half. Hopefully the title gets mentioned in this for sure at the 2 Comic-Cons next year. It feels like there basically has to be a proper big panel where like Mike and Brian are there. They finally talk to us about the plan and like communicates about what exactly is happening, because we're expecting them to like, you know, maybe not full trailer stuff maybe at this point, but like show off some concept art stuff. Like everyone knows the image, you know, the leaked image that came out this year, but just the weirdness surrounding the idea of like everyone has it, but you know, they technically didn't release it publicly, but they did show it to a room of people. It's like, come on. We have to see this stuff kind of finally happen here. A delay would be really frustrating. So, you know, I just hope they have a plan in place for next year to actually talk about this, because it's cool to see how hyped and how much attention there is on Avatar at the moment because of the Netflix trailer. But it's also frustrating at the same time that the attention is on this other project, and it could be at least a little bit on this stuff if they communicated better. So yeah, strikes are over, but yes, I have heard the kind of rumors and stuff like that animation stuff might be going kind of on strike next, and that would properly affect Avatar Studios kind of more than anything already has. And especially like, because one of the few things we heard about Avatar Studios this year was about layoffs. It's concerning in a way, the lack of communication, but we just have to hope that they actually deliver. And that's the big thing, of course. It does mean like we probably have a light couple of weeks kind of coming up where there's not too much happening. Like obviously soundtrack next week, just a few days away. That will be exciting. But the rest of the year doesn't really have anything obvious. Obviously Netflix Avatar will have, we assume, a bigger build-up January into February for the release. And then we have to hope that something like... What did I just do there? Something like one of these events actually delivers. Because we have to assume if they show something at like a CinemaCon again, an accidental release won't happen again. We won't be that lucky that we got to see that image. But hopefully they'll have more official stuff at that point. But yeah. I suppose one maybe final topic would just be like the name of... Sorry. What are they going to do about the name of this movie? Like, we've all been wondering, like, are they finally going to reveal like the name of the Avatar franchise going forward? Because it can't just be Avatar, because that's Blue People Avatar. Avatar Legends, all this other sort of stuff. It's an Avatar The Last Airbender movie, so I'm assuming they'll keep the well-known title. And I guess we'll just get a subtitle. It would be interesting if they were kind of willing to lead with the idea of like, this is Avatar Legends and its subtitle, and they kind of clarify that, but it does probably feel like for Avatar and Korra, they'll stick to Avatar The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra. But they're going to have to switch it up. Because, like, say they do, like, a Kyoshi show, or, like, let's say Kyoshi mini-series. How do they call this? Do they do, like, Legend of Kyoshi? Because I would have a problem if they went for Avatar The Last Airbender something Kyoshi, because I think we need to move away from that. Avatar Legends Kyoshi. But, like, are they... The thing with Avatar Legends, though, is, like, it's at the moment, it's very specific to, for the most part, the RPG. The Attack on Titan final season stuff. Oh yeah, that's so funny. Attack on Titan, the final season, the final chapters, special 2, the actual finale. So yeah, like there's Avatar. What do we have at this point? We have Avatar Legends, Avatar Verse gets thrown around a little bit. There's Chronicles of the Avatar. Because I'm assuming they are not going to like include Avatar Studios specifically in anything. That is just the studio name, and that will have like they'll have their fancy title card like stuff for like the studio that made it, like they do for like Star Wars and MCU. But that's not going to be related to titling at all. So it kind of feels like they have to go for one of these. This I think is too kind of fan speaky. So I'd be really. I don't think they're going to go for this. Either of the other two I think works, but the association of them with like specific things in publishing maybe works a little bit against it. Avatar Legends is definitely the one that I think works the best, but they need to kind of figure out what they're doing here, because like otherwise, like if they remove Avatar from this, then like what do you actually kind of go for here? Because then suddenly you're probably like associating the franchise with like bending, elements, nations, and my assumption is that they probably will stay away from having bending specifically be a heavy part of titling. Elements could work. Like if they have to properly rename and move maybe away from Avatar for some sort of an overall franchise type thing, I can see them doing some sort of a kind of thing here. But I do think Avatar has to be here somehow. Like for elements. Elements is probably the other thing you could do, but it might feel a bit too general. As for the whole the whole James Cameron thing is just like, look, Avatar, as much Blue People Avatar, as much as it's gonna be that the thing where like it'll always make a large amount of money, it still feels like it hasn't quite had the sort of cultural impact that actual Avatar has had. It is just one of those big movie things that is just going to exist. And I don't know, I do sort of get the impression that it will always just be the thing where, like, when people say Avatar, most will ultimately be like, oh yeah, like, as in airbender, bending elements Avatar. And then the other one's just like, oh yeah, the thing with the blue people. So it's just one of those ones where, like, they just have to, I think just stick to this probably, or if they can come up with some sort of a different thing, because I'm trying to think of like what they have going for them, because obviously like Star Wars is Star Wars, like they have the perfect title right there, like there's stuff like that that's already set in place, but because we can't specifically just use like Avatar just on its own, uh, yeah, they definitely have to avoid marketing confusion. Yeah, if they have all these different projects, because like, yeah, the idea, like, as we go through this, because we have like a 2025 team Avatar movie, let's say 2025 Earth Avatar series. We assume that this one will be like ATLA subtitle. But then this is a new Avatar potentially. So what do they actually call this? Based on Korra, it would be like Legend of X, name of Avatar. And like, is that enough? This is where it feels like there kind of needs to be the subtitle. Because I don't know if you, like, it's going to come across a little bit weird if you do like Avatar Legends, subtitle Legend of whatever. That's a bit weird. You have that, and then the most specific thing probably is when they start to do stuff that's not the obvious, like when they start to do, say, like spin-offs, and potentially we're not maybe directly focused on a specific Avatar. What do we do then? That's the real problem. Because, like, Avatar Legends does work for everything, pretty much. But it does kind of create the problem if you're going for, like, new avatars. But then, I don't know, do you just change it to, like, the movie title stuff? Like, yeah, Dawn of Yang Chen, Rise of Kyoshi, Chronicles of the Avatar, this is where, like, I kind of wonder, like, do they get away with ultimately just the idea that they have Avatar Studios, they have that logo with the 4 elements, and kind of like Marvel always does, like, their movies aren't called like MCU blah or like whatever Marvel this, that, and the other. Like that's sort of just almost like an implied subtitle at the start. Do they get away with sort of just the movie is just called whatever, and you just know based on like the poster or whatever that the logo is there. It's Avatar Studios. Everyone knows because of those element symbols, and Avatar is there in the studio name. That's what it is. That you can then just get away with whatever it is because you're going to have like a consistent art style. No one will mistake any Avatar project for being something different. It's so difficult. Like, you know, they do need to sort this out. And I think relatively soon, but we'll see what they do. But it's something we've been dealing with definitely for a while now. Just seeing what they could actually do. The Zuko movie, they could do like Avatar Fire Lord Zuko. That is the interesting point of like, are they actually not allowed to just go kind of like Avatar? Let's just do like Return of. I'm just gonna make this up. Like if they just go with that. Like, are they actually based on like copyright reasons not allowed to use this because of James Cameron Avatar? Just because of this word? Like this can't be the first word in a title. Be this, even though what they'll be like whatever copyright trademarking is the overall thing. This is a weird one because the difference here obviously is the idea of like the word avatar is like an actual word. So it's one of those ones where like this is a word that like it has like kind of modern meanings. It basically to a certain degree like what has like religious meanings as well. You would say fundamentally both series use it in different ways. It's one of those ones where like, you know, you could probably argue in court that they're different, but like, do they want to do that? And then I don't think they want to go with the last Airbender because this was at some point the title of Korra, if I remember correctly. At a certain point we had information that suggested that this is what the second series was going to be called, but they obviously didn't go with this. For whatever reason, whether that's just TLA on its own, tainted because of the movie a little bit, or because it doesn't make sense because it's a title that fits one era of Avatar, basically. Two technically, kind of. But, you know, like it only fits a small portion of the Avatar franchise because in every other era, there are airbenders, so I don't know. Hmm. Like there's something, I suppose, like that kind of works. Um but I can't see them perhaps like overcomplicating it like this. So I don't know. Um uh yeah, like I don't know. As I keep looking at this, I'm like, I'm not sure this is very good. But it's something. There we go. Nice and easy. Every single word possible. Um hmm. But yeah, I'm guessing they're just going to use Avatar Legends eventually. They'll bring it in. Um, Avatar Verse, like they Janet Varney and Dante Bosco have used this a few times on the Braving the Elements podcast, but I'm not really sure how official of a title necessarily this is. Um, I think most people, I don't know, like I don't super like this as a term. Especially in terms of a title, I think they never title something like Avatar Verse, like Legend of Korra or anything like that. Um, oh, oh yeah, I forgot that that's a thing. Yeah, Doctor Who, they did announce their kind of their own multi-project kind of thing that is Whoniverse. Yeah, they might just do it. Like I think the question that we probably have here is like, if we finally get a website, what's the name of the website for Avatar? Because like I'm assuming they might just do Avatar Studios. But I think kind of Avatar Legends kind of fits. Avatar the website. Yeah, that actually might be the only other way to title it. If they want to have a thing, Master of Elements, Master of the Elements. It is the other, like, title of the avatar. Like, avatar means. I think we just need to hijack like every single title. Like, we can even claim Blue People Avatar because of this. But yeah, the titling stuff is just a silly kind of thing that exists. I don't know, like, they seem to have just kind of persisted kind of going forward. Like, so yeah, Avatar Legends, or just everything is going to be maybe ATLA subtitle. It just feels like that's the way it's just going to work. We'll see. We'll see what they do. Because, I don't know, how much confusion will people have if they just make it very clear this is what it is? We need to see how they approach marketing, all this sort of stuff going forward. Like, will social media accounts like change to anything new, or are we just keeping things to what they are? It's a really kind of tricky kind of process. But yeah, probably gonna wrap up the stream there. So to discuss next stream. So obviously my plan at the start of the year was do a stream every single month. So far we've hit that and more. A couple of extra streams as well. So at the very least, one more to go for December. Not sure what's going to necessarily have happened in December to talk about in terms of a more kind of like up-to-date thing. But I'll do some sort of a stream where we can cover some stuff. Who knows? There might be some more Netflix Avatar stuff that they release in December. There's always the chance Avatar Studios decide before the end of the year, maybe we want to say something, and they put out like a video, and there is something that's kind of exciting. Otherwise, I don't know, like last day of Avatar Generations, maybe I'll do a stream for that. That's like, what, 2nd of December? Might be something maybe worth doing. Just doing a stream during the final couple of hours of that game being live, and we can kind of talk about like pretty much anything, like just open like questions and stuff like that for pretty much everything. There's that's probably my kind of like if nothing else happens, the December stream, I think, will just be the Avatar Generations kind of, while just general chatting about like all things Avatar. But we'll see if there's anything else, because December is usually pretty busy for me, because I have the 3 end of year videos that I do, top 5 story moments from the year, the year in review for 2023, and then the 2024 preview video. The last 2 especially being kind of quite long videos in terms of how long it takes to make them. I actually have most of the top 5 story moment stuff done, because of course the Azula comic was the last piece of story content that came out in the year. There's nothing else coming with Avatar Generations dying, unfortunately. But yeah, it does mean that video will probably not be like too far away. I still have to record the audio for it, but that video, I'm probably going to roughly aim to release that probably like very early December, just because why hold on to it when it is going to be covering the entire year. But yeah, so might be very early December actually. What way does the timing work out for that? December 2nd is a Saturday, so that is a stream day that I could do. That's going to be the last day for Avatar Generations. Maybe. Otherwise, we'll see if any news happens. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming out to the stream. It's been the 2nd November stream after the Netflix discussion. But yeah, thanks for joining me on the Azula discussion, the title discussion as well. But yeah, that's been it. Thanks for watching, and bye.